Today we're diving into three of Jesus' most famous miracles. But we're not just looking at what happened, we're looking at why. We're going to explore, based on the analysis of theologian Dr. Robert Newman, how these incredible events might have been powerful, coded messages for the people who first heard them.
So here's our game plan. First, we need to get on the same page about what a biblical miracle even is, according to our source. Then, we're going to open up 3 separate case files, digging into the details of each one. And at the end, we'll connect all the dots to see what bigger picture these stories are actually painting.
All right, first things first. What are we even talking about when we say biblical miracle? Well, in this framework, it's not just some random amazing thing that happens. It has to have 3 key parts. It's got to be a stunning event, it's got to show some kind of supernatural power, and, this is the most important part, it's meant to mean something. It's less of a magic trick and way more like a very powerful, very deliberate message.
Okay, let's open our first case file, the miraculous catch. So, picture this. We're on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. You've got these fishermen, Simon Peter among them, and they are just bone-tired, cleaning their empty nets after pulling an all-nighter and catching absolutely nothing. You can just feel the skepticism in Peter's voice, right? I mean, these guys are pros. They know you don't fish in the middle of the day, and they've already come up completely empty. But he says, okay, fine, and agrees to try one more time. And the result? A haul of fish so massive, their nets start ripping, and their boats actually begin to sink.
So, of course, your first thought is, okay, was this really supernatural, or is there a more down-to-earth explanation? I mean, it seems possible that Jesus was just in the right spot in the boat and could see a giant school of fish that the guys had somehow missed.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source brings up some basic physics. While that theory sounds good, the way light actually refracts or bends when it hits water means that from a boat, you can really only see a few feet down and out, nowhere near far enough to spot a school of fish big enough to almost sink 2 boats. So with that simple explanation kind of off the table, the analysis shifts to the meaning. And to get that, you have to think like someone from the 1st century. Their whole world of stories was the Old Testament, and it's packed with examples of God directing animals. You know, the fish that swallowed Jonah, the plagues, the quail in the desert, and even deeper, they had this idea that humans were supposed to have authority over fish, but that it was lost.
And that's the real punchline here. According to this analysis, this event wasn't just about showing off or getting a big catch, it was a massive symbolic statement. For those listening, it would have pointed to Jesus as a figure who was restoring that lost dominion over nature, kind of like a second Adam.
All right, let's move on to case file number 2. This is one of the most famous stories ever. You've probably heard it. You've got a gigantic crowd, they're in the middle of nowhere, and it's getting late. People are hungry, and there's basically no food. I mean, Andrew just lays out how ridiculous the situation is. You have a crowd big enough to fill a small arena, 5,000 men, not even counting women and children, and all the food they can find is one kid's lunch. It's an impossible problem. Now, a really popular idea today is that this wasn't about creating food out of thin air. The theory goes that the little boy's act of sharing shamed everyone else into pulling out the food they had hidden away. So, was this a miracle of multiplication or just a powerful lesson in generosity? That lesson in sharing idea is pretty compelling for sure. But the source argues that the original accounts have these weird little details that just don't fit that theory. Things like mentioning the green grass, which pinpoints the time of year to spring, the specific type of Jewish baskets they used, and that strange command to gather up 12 baskets of leftovers. The analysis suggests these are the kinds of details you get from an eyewitness, not from a simple fable. And just like with the fish, for the people hearing this story, all sorts of bells would have been going off in their heads. They would have immediately thought of God providing manna in the wilderness, or the prophets Elijah and Elisha miraculously multiplying just a little bit of food to feed people. And here's the critical difference. In those older stories, Moses is like the middleman. He just announces that God is going to provide food. But here, Jesus is presented as the actual source. He's the one who takes the bread, gives thanks, and it multiplies. It's a huge shift, meant to position him not as just another prophet, but as the bread of life himself. Okay, our last case file, and this one might be the weirdest of them all. It's this strange little story about paying a tax, but it's really about making a huge theological point without giving a big speech. I mean, just listen to how specific that instruction to Peter is. Go fishing, and the very first fish you pull up will have the exact coin you need to pay the temple tax for both of you. It's
wild.
What's so fascinating is how the story is actually told. So Peter gets cornered about this tax. But before he can even bring it up with Jesus, Jesus already knows what happened. He gives this incredibly bizarre instruction, and then the story just moves on. Finding the coin is treated as such a sure thing that the writer doesn't even bother describing it. But see, the miracle is just the setup. It's the proof for the point he's about to make. This tax, it was for the atonement of your souls. Everyone had to pay it to be right with God. But Jesus makes this quiet but totally radical claim. He asks Peter, do kings tax their own kids or other people? Peter says, other people. And Jesus replies, then the sons are exempt. He's basically saying, I'm a son of the God this temple is for, so that tax doesn't apply to me.
And that's where it all comes together so brilliantly. The power to control one specific fish to deliver one specific coin is the proof of his claim. He's demonstrating a unique sonship. He pays the tax, but not because he has to. He pays it to make a point, asserting his authority over the very system demanding the payment.
So we've looked at 3 really different stories, right? A haul of fish, a massive picnic, and a weird tax payment. Let's zoom out now and see how these pieces fit together to create a much bigger picture.
When you lay it all out like this, you can see a clear progression. The catch of fish is about restoring lost dominion. Feeding the crowd is about being a provider, but one who is way more direct than Moses. And finally, the coin and the fish is a claim to a unique sonship and authority over the entire religious system. Each one builds on the last.
So the big takeaway from this analysis is that these aren't just random acts of power. They're presented as very specific, very meaningful signs. And when you look at them together, they tell one cohesive story, that this person, Jesus, is the one who fixes what's broken in the world and has direct personal authority over all of it. And that leaves us with the final, pretty massive question this analysis raises. If you take these stories as they're presented, they're not just about fish and bread anymore. They become carefully crafted arguments about who's really in charge. And they force us to ask, what if reality doesn't work the way we assume it does? And who, or what, truly has authority over it all?